standing in a dimly lit hallway at midnight, my hand still raised to knock again, when the door swings open and I'm face to face with the most dangerous man in Chicago, wearing nothing but a black silk bathrobe that hangs open just enough to reveal a chest carved from violence and discipline, and blood, fresh and crimson, drips from his knuckles onto the pristine marble floor between us, like some kind of horrific greeting I never asked for. My breath catches in my throat, freezing there alongside every coherent thought I possessed just seconds ago, and I can feel the rain from outside still streaming down my face, mixing with what might be tears, or might just be the complete dissolution of my composure. Because this is not Mika's door, this is not my best friend's safe haven, and this man looking at me with eyes the color of a frozen lake in winter is definitely not someone who's going to let me simply apologize for the intrusion and back away slowly into the night like this never happened. His eyes travel over me with the kind of assessment that makes my skin prickle with awareness, despite the fact that I'm soaked to the bone. My designer dress, the one Julian insisted I wear to his insufferable charity gala earlier tonight, is clinging to my body like a second skin, and my carefully styled hair has become a wild, dark mess that probably makes me look like something that crawled out of Lake Michigan after a particularly brutal storm. "Wrong door," I managed to whisper, my voice coming out smaller and more broken than I intended, and I'm already taking a step backward, my survival instincts finally overriding the paralysis that had gripped me the moment those ice-blue eyes locked onto mine, with an intensity that feels like being pinned beneath a microscope, wielded by someone who sees far too much, far too quickly. But before I can take another step, before I can turn and run down this hallway to find the right apartment, 12C, not 12B, how could I have been so stupid? His hand shoots out with a speed that shouldn't be possible for a man his size, catching my wrist in a grip that's firm enough to stop me but not quite hard enough to hurt. And the warmth of his skin against mine sends a shock through my system that has nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with something far more primal and dangerous. "You're running from something," he states rather than asks, his voice a low rumble that seems to vibrate through the air between us, carrying with it an accent I can't quite place. Russian, maybe, buried under years of American English, but still present in the way certain consonants catch in his throat, like gravel rolling over smooth stones. I want to deny it. Want to pull myself together and lie with the same practiced ease that I've developed over the past 3 years of living with Julian. But something about this man's unwavering stare strips away all my carefully constructed defenses, leaving me raw and exposed in a way that terrifies me almost as much as what I'm running from. "My fiancé," I hear myself say, the word tasting like poison on my tongue, and I watch as something shifts in those glacial eyes, a flicker of recognition or perhaps calculation, like he's filing away this information into some mental database, where he keeps track of everyone's weaknesses and vulnerabilities for future exploitation. The sound of the elevator doors opening down the hall shatters whatever strange moment has formed between us, and my heart, which was already racing, kicks into overdrive as I hear Julian's voice echoing through the corridor. That smooth, cultured tone that once made me feel special and chosen, but now only makes my stomach turn with the kind of nausea that comes from intimate knowledge of exactly how cruel beautiful things can be. "Sarah!" His voice carries that edge of controlled anger that I've learned to recognize as a precursor to the kind of night that leaves bruises in places no one else will see. The kind of psychological warfare that makes you question your own reality until you're no longer sure what's real and what's the distorted version he's convinced you to believe. The man in front of me, this stranger with blood on his hands and ice in his eyes, doesn't hesitate, doesn't ask for permission or explanation, but instead pulls me into his penthouse with a fluid motion that speaks of someone accustomed to making split-second decisions that other people's lives depend on, and his hand covers my mouth before I can make a sound, his body pressing mine against the wall just inside the doorway as he kicks the door shut with his foot, the lock sliding into place with a soft click that sounds deafening in the sudden silence. "Not a sound, Kotyonok," he breathes against my ear, the unfamiliar word rolling off his tongue like silk and steel combined, and I can feel every inch of his body against mine. Hard muscle and controlled power, and the kind of danger that my hindbrain recognizes, even if my conscious mind is still trying to catch up with the rapid sequence of events that has brought me to this impossible moment. I can hear Julian in the hallway, can hear him knocking on doors, his voice growing sharper with each passing second. And I know that tone. Know exactly what happens when Julian Crest doesn't get what he wants. When something he considers his property has the audacity to walk away from him, like I had any right to autonomy or choice in the matter. The stranger holding me hasn't moved, hasn't so much as breathed differently. And I realize with a start that he's listening, tracking Julian's movements through the hallway with the focus of a predator waiting to see if the threat will pass or if he'll need to eliminate it entirely. And something about that realization, that this man is weighing the option of killing my fiancé as casually as someone else might consider ordering takeout, sends a shiver through my body that he definitely notices because his grip tightens fractionally, a silent communication that could mean comfort or warning or both. "Sarah, I know you're here," Julian calls out, and I can picture him perfectly. The Tom Ford suit that costs more than most people's monthly rent. The Patek Philippe watch on his wrist. The carefully maintained facade of the brilliant tech entrepreneur who donates to children's hospitals and sits on the boards of cultural institutions, while behind closed doors, he systematically destroys the woman who made the mistake of thinking his attention was love instead of ownership. The man holding me shifts slightly, and I catch a glimpse of his profile. Sharp jawline shadowed with dark stubble, a nose that looks like it's been broken at least once and set imperfectly. Lips that might be sensual if they weren't currently pressed into a thin line of concentration. And something about the way he holds himself, the absolute certainty in every movement, tells me that this is someone who's intimately familiar with violence, who's made an art form out of the kind of brutality that Julian only plays at. Minutes stretch like hours, my heartbeat thundering so loudly in my ears that I'm certain both men must be able to hear it. And I'm pressed so tightly against this stranger's chest that I can feel his heartbeat too. Steady and slow and completely unbothered by the situation we found ourselves in, as if hiding a rain-soaked woman from her dangerous fiancé is just another Tuesday night for him. Finally, mercifully, I hear Julian's footsteps retreating, hear the elevator ding and the doors slide open, and then silence settles over the hallway like a blanket, heavy and complete. But the man holding me doesn't release me immediately, doesn't step back and create distance, but instead stays exactly where he is for another 30 seconds, maybe 40, like he's making absolutely certain the threat has passed before he allows either of us to relax our guard. When he does finally step back, removing his hand from my mouth and putting a few inches of space between our bodies, I find that I'm trembling, my legs suddenly uncertain about their ability to keep me upright, and I have to press my palms against the cool wall behind me to steady myself as I try to process everything that just happened in the span of what couldn't have been more than 5 minutes, but feels like a lifetime. "Thank you," I whisper, though the words feel inadequate for what he just did, for the risk he just took by pulling a stranger into his home and hiding her from whatever danger she was fleeing. And I'm about to say something else, about to apologize again for knocking on his door and dragging him into my mess, when I really look at him for the first time, when my eyes adjust to the low lighting of his penthouse, and I see not just the man, but the space around him. The apartment is stunning in a cold, minimalist way that speaks of obscene wealth and absolutely no sentimentality. Marble floors, in charcoal gray, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, furniture that looks like it belongs in an architecture magazine, all clean lines and expensive materials. But there's something off about it. Something that makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and it takes me a moment to identify what it is. There's plastic sheeting on the floor near what I assume is the living room, the kind of heavy-duty plastic that painters use, except there are no paint cans anywhere in sight. And on a side table near the entrance, I can see a pair of leather gloves, the kind that are too nice to be for driving, but exactly right for leaving no fingerprints. And next to them, a crystal tumbler with what looks like whiskey, barely touched, as if someone was interrupted mid-drink by an unexpected visitor. "Who are you?" I ask, though I'm not entirely sure I want to know the answer, because every instinct I have is screaming that I've just traded one kind of danger for something potentially far worse. That in my desperation to escape Julian, I've stumbled into the territory of someone who makes Julian look like an amateur playing at being powerful. He's watching me with those unsettling eyes, and I can see him cataloging my reactions, reading me like I'm a book written in a language only he understands. And when he finally speaks, there's something almost amused in his voice, like he finds my fear entertaining in a way that should probably offend me but instead just makes me more nervous. "Konstantin Volkov," he says, extending his hand, the one without blood on it, in a gesture that feels absurdly formal given the circumstances, and I stare at that offered hand for a long moment before the name clicks into place in my memory, before I remember where I've heard it before. Julian had mentioned that name exactly once, late at night after too much scotch, when he thought I was already asleep, during a phone call with someone he was trying to intimidate by dropping names of people who supposedly owed him favors. But when he said Volkov, the person on the other end must have laughed or called his bluff, because Julian's voice had gone tight and angry, and he'd said something about staying out of the Bratva's territory, about not being stupid enough to cross certain lines. Bratva, Russian Mafia, and I'm standing in his penthouse at midnight, soaking wet and terrified, having just been saved by a man whose hands are literally stained with someone else's blood. And the worst part, the absolutely worst part, is that when he looks at me with those ice-blue eyes that should terrify me, when he stands there in his silk bathrobe looking like sin personified and utterly unbothered by the chaos I've brought to his doorstep, I don't feel the urge to run. I feel, for the first time in 3 years, like maybe I've finally found someone more dangerous than the monster I've been living with. And the thought that follows that realization is the one that should send me screaming into the night but instead roots me to the spot. Maybe the only way to escape one monster is to make a deal with another. I don't take his offered hand. Can't bring myself to touch him again after that moment against the wall, where every nerve ending in my body seemed to catch fire despite the absolute wrongness of the situation. And I watch as something flickers across his face. Not offense exactly, but a kind of acknowledgement that I've made a choice, drawn a line in the sand between us, however futile that boundary might be given, that I'm trapped in his penthouse with nowhere else to go, and a fiancé hunting for me somewhere in this building. I need to leave, I say, trying to inject some strength into my voice, trying to sound like someone who has options and agency instead of a drowned rat who stumbled into the wrong apartment and is now realizing exactly how catastrophically that mistake might cost her. But Konstantin, because I suppose I should think of him by his name now that he's given it to me, simply shakes his head slowly, deliberately, like he's dealing with a child who doesn't quite understand the game being played around her. "No," he says, the single word carrying enough weight and finality that it might as well be a physical barrier between me and the door, and then he moves past me with that same predatory grace I noticed earlier, heading toward what I assume is a bathroom, based on the sound of running water that follows. And I'm left standing there in my soaked designer prison, wondering what exactly I'm supposed to do now that my escape plan has been derailed by the worst possible stroke of luck. When he returns, his hands are clean, the blood washed away to reveal long fingers, and the kind of calluses that don't come from typing on keyboards or signing business deals but from gripping weapons and probably doing things I don't want to imagine in too much detail. And he's carrying a towel which he tosses to me with casual ease, as if we're old friends and this is perfectly normal, as if I haven't just invaded his space and witnessed something I definitely wasn't meant to see. "You're shivering," he observes, moving to a bar cart that looks like it costs more than my student loans did, and pouring 2 glasses of what I assume is the same whiskey from the tumbler I noticed earlier. And the domesticity of the gesture feels surreal against the backdrop of everything else. The plastic sheeting, the blood that was on his hands, the way he's watching me even when he appears to be focused on something else. I wrap the towel around my shoulders because he's right. I am shivering, though I'm not entirely sure it's from the cold anymore. and I watch as he brings one of the glasses to me, holding it out with the same expectant patience he showed with his handshake. Like he has all the time in the world to wait for me to accept what he's offering, even though we both know I don't really have a choice in the matter. I don't drink. I lie. Because the truth, that Julian controls what I eat and drink and wear and say and think, feels too vulnerable to share with this stranger who's already seen too much of my weakness. But Constantine's lips quirk into something that might be a smile if it reached his eyes, which it decidedly does not. "Tonight you do, Solnishko," he says, another one of those Russian words that I don't understand, but that somehow sounds both endearing and threatening when spoken in that deep voice that seems to resonate in my chest. And he presses the glass into my hand, his fingers brushing against mine in a touch that's either accidental or very deliberately calculated to remind me that he could touch me whenever he wants, that I'm in his space and subject to his rules now. The whiskey burns going down, expensive and smooth and nothing like the cheap vodka I used to drink in college before Julian decided that I needed to be refined and educated in the finer things, before he systematically stripped away every part of me that was rough around the edges and replaced it with this polished, perfect version that exists entirely for his pleasure and convenience. "Julian Kress?" Constantine says, settling into an armchair that probably costs more than a luxury sedan, arranging his bathrobe with an elegant casualness that shouldn't be possible but somehow is. And the way he says Julian's name makes it clear that this isn't a question, but rather a statement of fact, a confirmation of something he already knows or has already deduced from the limited information I've given him. "You know him," I say. And it's not really a question either, because of course he knows him, because men like Konstantin Volkov make it their business to know everyone who operates in their city, everyone who might be a threat or an asset, or simply someone whose existence needs to be noted and filed away for future reference. "We have business complications," he replies, which is such a carefully neutral way of describing whatever relationship exists between a Russian mob boss and a tech entrepreneur that I almost want to laugh. Except there's nothing funny about the situation I've found myself in, nothing amusing about the fact that I've accidentally placed myself in the middle of whatever territorial disputes or financial arrangements, or God knows what else connects these two men. I take another sip of whiskey, letting it burn away some of the anxiety that's been building in my chest since I ran out of Julian's gala, since I made the split-second decision that 3 years of psychological torture was finally enough. That I would rather risk everything than spend one more night pretending that his version of love was something I should be grateful for. "He'll be looking for me," I say, stating the obvious because I need to fill the silence, need to break the intensity of Constantine's stare, which hasn't wavered since he sat down, and I'm starting to understand that this is what he does. This watching and waiting and analyzing, breaking people down into component parts until he understands exactly how they work and exactly how to use them. "Let him look," Constantine says with such casual dismissal that it takes me a moment to process the implications, to understand that he's not just being cavalier, but is actually unbothered by the prospect of Julian Kress, billionaire tech mogul, with connections to half the city's power players, coming after what he perceives as his property. I'm about to respond, about to try to explain that Julian isn't someone who can be dismissed so easily, when I notice something that makes my blood run cold despite the warmth of the whiskey spreading through my system. There's a chess set on the table between us, beautiful and intricate. And when I look closer, I realize that the pieces aren't carved from wood or molded from plastic, but are instead made from spent bullet casings, each one carefully crafted into pawns and rooks and knights. A grotesque work of art that represents everything about this man's world that I should want nothing to do with. "You're valuable to him," Constantine continues, seemingly oblivious to my horror at his choice of decor, though I'm beginning to suspect that nothing escapes this man's notice, that every detail of my reaction is being catalogued and assessed for future use. Which means you're valuable to me, though perhaps for different reasons than the ones that make him hunt you through my building at midnight. The possessive pronoun doesn't escape my notice. My building, not the building, because of course he owns it. Because men like Konstantin Volkov don't simply rent penthouses in luxury high-rises. They own the entire structure and probably half the block besides. And I'm realizing with growing dread that I haven't just stumbled into any random apartment, but have instead walked directly into the heart of his territory, his home base, the place where he's most powerful and most dangerous. His phone buzzes on the side table, an expensive piece of technology that looks almost mundane next to the bullet chess set. And he picks it up with the kind of languid movement that suggests he's not particularly concerned with whatever message he's receiving. But I watch as his eyes scan the screen, and something shifts in his expression. A hardening around the jaw, a narrowing of those ice-blue eyes that makes him look less like a man and more like a wolf that's just caught an interesting scent. "Your fiancé has men positioned in the lobby and the parking garage," he says conversationally, as if he's commenting on the weather, rather than informing me that I'm essentially trapped, that my impulsive flight from Julian's control has resulted in me being cornered in the worst possible location by the worst possible person. And he's made some calls to people who think they have influence in this city, people who believe that money and connections mean something when it comes to retrieving what belongs to them. The way he says belongs to them makes it clear what he thinks of Julian's claim on me, makes it obvious that Constantine operates by a different set of rules entirely, rules that I don't understand, but that apparently include some kind of code about possession and ownership that Julian has violated by pursuing me into territory that isn't his. "I'll tell him it was a mistake," I say, desperation creeping into my voice because I can see where this is going, can feel the walls closing in as I realize that I've become a piece on someone else's chessboard, a pawn in whatever game these two men are playing. "I'll tell him I got confused about which apartment was Mika's. I'll go back. You'll do nothing of the sort," Constantine interrupts, and there's steel in his voice now, the kind of absolute authority that makes it clear this isn't a suggestion or a request, but a command. And he stands with fluid grace that makes the bathrobe shift and reveal more of that sculpted chest, moving toward me with purpose. "Because Julian Kress doesn't deserve to have you return to him like a lost package, and more importantly, because you came to my door, which means you're mine now, whether you intended it or not." I should be terrified by this declaration, should be backing away from him and demanding that he let me leave, should be doing anything other than standing here frozen as he approaches. But there's something about the way he said "mine" that was fundamentally different from the way Julian uses that word. Something that suggested protection rather than possession, even though I know that's probably just wishful thinking on my part. My desperate brain trying to find safety in a situation where none exists. "I can help you destroy him," Constantine says, and he's close enough now that I can smell expensive cologne mixed with something darker, something that might be gunpowder residue or might just be my imagination running wild. I can take apart his little empire piece by piece, can expose every dirty deal and backroom arrangement that's allowed him to build his fortune, can make him understand what it means to lose something he values. But you'll need to stay here, under my protection, and you'll need to help me understand exactly how his mind works, what vulnerabilities he has that I can exploit. It's a deal with the devil, presented in the most straightforward terms possible, and I should say no, should refuse to trade one form of captivity for another. But when I look into those ice-blue eyes, I see something that Julian's carefully calculated cruelty never contained. I see honest brutality, violence that doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is, power that doesn't dress itself up in the language of love and concern and protection, while it systematically destroys everything you are. "And what happens to me after you've destroyed him?" I ask, because I need to know if I'm just exchanging one prison for another. If Constantine's protection comes with chains that are simply more honest about being chains. "That depends entirely on what you want," he says, reaching out to tuck a strand of wet hair behind my ear, in a gesture that's almost tender, except for the calluses on his fingers and the weight of everything unsaid between us. "But I can promise you this, Solnishko. You'll never be helpless again. Never be the kind of prey that men like Julian hunt for sport, because I'm going to teach you exactly how dangerous you can be when you stop pretending that being soft is the same as being safe." Before I can respond, before I can process the implications of what he's offering, His phone rings with the kind of insistent tone that suggests this isn't a call he can ignore, and when he answers it, speaking in rapid Russian that I can't understand, I watch his expression change from calculated interest to something colder, something that reminds me that this man isn't offering me salvation, but simply a different kind of damnation. He ends the call and looks at me with an intensity that makes my breath catch. And when he speaks, his voice carries the weight of decisions already made, paths already chosen, futures already written in blood and bullets, and the kind of violence that doesn't ask for permission. Your fiancé knows you're in this building, and he's threatening to involve people who will make this complicated for me unless I return you within the hour, Constantine says, moving to a closet near the entrance and pulling out what I initially think is a jacket before I realize it's a shoulder holster, the kind designed to hold a gun against the body, in a way that's both accessible and concealed. So I'm going to give you a choice right now, Sarah Dmitriev. You can walk out that door and go back to him, back to the life you were running from, or you can stay here and let me turn you into the kind of weapon that men like Julian never see coming until it's already too late. The fact that he knows my full name, that he's somehow learned my patronymic despite me never giving it to him, should probably concern me more than it does. But all I can focus on is the choice he's presenting. The binary decision that will determine everything that comes after this moment. And I'm watching as he straps the holster across his chest, as he transforms from a man in a bathrobe to something far more dangerous. And I realize that this is who Konstantin Volkov really is. Not the cultured host offering whiskey, but the predator who's been playing with his food, waiting to see what decision I'll make before he decides what to do with me. I stay, I whisper, the words coming out before I can second-guess them, before fear and rationality can override the desperate, reckless part of me that knows going back to Julian means dying slowly over years, instead of all at once. And I watch as something that might be satisfaction crosses Konstantin's face. Good, he says, and then he's moving toward his bedroom, gesturing for me to follow, and I should ask where we're going, should demand answers about what happens next. But instead I find myself trailing after him, like I've been doing this forever. Like following dangerous men into unknown situations is something I'm already accustomed to. Because Julian just made a very serious mistake by bringing this to my doorstep, and I'm going to need you to tell me everything you know about how he thinks, how he operates, every weakness and vulnerability you've observed in the 3 years you've spent surviving him. And in return, I'm going to show you what it looks like when someone actually keeps their promises about protection. He opens a closet that's bigger than my bedroom in Julian's penthouse, filled with clothes in my size, my exact size. And I'm staring at designer labels and expensive fabrics and realizing with a creeping sense of horror that this wasn't improvised, that somehow Konstantin knew I was coming, or at least knew enough about me to be prepared for this possibility. And when I turn to look at him, to demand an explanation for how this is possible, I find him watching me with those calculating eyes that see far too much. How long have you been planning this? I ask, my voice barely above a whisper because I'm not sure I want to know the answer. Not sure I'm ready to understand just how thoroughly I've been maneuvered into this position. Since the moment Julian Kress made the mistake of mentioning his beautiful fiancée to the wrong person at the wrong time, Konstantin replies, and there's something almost predatory in his smile now, something that makes it clear I haven't stumbled into his protection by accident, but have instead walked directly into a trap that was set months ago. And since the moment I realized that the best way to destroy a man like him isn't through his business or his reputation, but through taking away the one thing he's convinced himself he owns completely. The implications hit me like a physical blow. The understanding that I've been a target all along, that my decision to run tonight wasn't the beginning of this story, but simply the moment when all the pieces Konstantin had been carefully arranging finally fell into place exactly where he wanted them. And I should be angry, should be terrified, should be demanding that he let me leave immediately. But instead, all I can think is that if I was going to be someone's weapon, at least I chose the hand that's willing to teach me how to cut. Morning arrives with the kind of pale winter sunlight that seems more like an accusation than a comfort. filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Constantine's penthouse and illuminating the fact that I've spent the night in the bedroom of a man whose reputation is built on the kind of violence that makes hardened criminals nervous. And I wake up in silk sheets that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe, used to before Julian decided to dress me like a doll. Disoriented and uncertain, whether the events of last night were some kind of fever dream brought on by desperation and fear. But then I see the clothes laid out at the foot of the bed. A cashmere sweater in deep burgundy that looks impossibly soft, tailored black pants that I somehow know will fit perfectly, and undergarments that are the right size and style and brand that I prefer. Which means Constantine's preparation for my arrival was even more thorough than I'd realized in the shocked haze of last night's revelations. And I understand with crystalline clarity that this is real. That I've traded Julian's gilded cage for something far more complex, and potentially far more dangerous. I find Constantine in the kitchen, which is all gleaming stainless steel and black marble, looking completely different from the man in the bathrobe from last night, because now he's dressed in dark slacks and a crisp white shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that are all muscle and tendon, and the kind of casual strength that comes from a lifetime of physical discipline. And he's making breakfast, actually cooking, not ordering from some expensive restaurant or having staff prepare elaborate meals. And the domesticity of the scene is so incongruous with everything else I know about him that I almost laugh. "Coffee is on the counter," he says without turning around, somehow sensing my presence even though I've been standing in the doorway trying to reconcile the image of this man, whisking eggs with the same hands that had blood on them last night, and I move toward the promised caffeine because I need something to ground me. Something familiar and normal in a situation that is anything but. The coffee is perfect. 2 sugars, a splash of cream. Exactly how I take it even though I never told him. Which means he's been watching me for longer than I want to think about. Learning my habits and preferences and routines with the same meticulous attention to detail that he probably applies to planning whatever dark business ventures keep him at the top of Chicago's criminal hierarchy. "You're wondering how I know," Constantine observes, still focused on the eggs but clearly aware of every micro-expression crossing my face, every hesitation and uncertainty that I'm trying desperately to hide behind a facade of composure that's growing more threadbare by the moment. And the answer is that I make it my business to know everything about the people who matter in my city, and you, Solnishko, have mattered for quite some time now, even if you didn't realize it. He plates the eggs alongside what appears to be homemade blini with caviar and smoked salmon. The kind of breakfast that manages to be both simple and extravagant, and gestures for me to sit at the island that probably seats 8, but currently has 2 place settings, arranged with the kind of careful precision that suggests this morning ritual is important to him. That despite everything else about his life being chaos and violence and strategic calculation, this moment of civilized domesticity is something he values. "I don't understand why," I say, accepting the plate he slides across the marble surface toward me, and I'm proud that my voice sounds relatively steady, despite the fact that my hands are shaking slightly as I pick up the fork, betraying the anxiety that I'm trying so hard to keep buried beneath layers of practiced calm. Because Julian Kress has been expanding his operation into territories that don't belong to him, making deals with people who should know better than to trust a man whose entire empire is built on stolen code and exploited labor, and the kind of financial manipulation that looks legal only because he's paid the right people to look the other way, Constantine explains, settling onto the stool across from me with the fluid grace that characterizes all his movements, and I'm struck again by the contradiction he presents. Refined and brutal, cultured and savage, a man who quotes Russian literature while planning murders. Before I can respond, before I can begin to unpack the implications of what he's telling me about Julian's business dealings and what role I'm supposed to play in whatever revenge scenario Constantine has orchestrated, there's a knock at the door that makes me jump, my fight-or-flight instinct still raw and oversensitive from last night's escape. But Constantine merely glances at an expensive watch that probably costs more than a luxury car and nods as if this interruption is exactly on schedule. The man who enters has the kind of face that suggests he's seen things that would break most people. all hard angles and suspicious eyes that immediately fix on me with an intensity that makes Constantine's attention feel almost gentle by comparison. And from the way he moves, economical, efficient, always maintaining awareness of exits and potential threats, I know this is someone dangerous, someone who's survived in Constantine's world through a combination of skill and ruthlessness that probably rivals his boss's. "Dmitri," Constantine says by way of introduction, not bothering to explain who I am or why I'm sitting in his kitchen eating breakfast, like this is a perfectly normal morning. My second in command, and the man who's going to be very vocal about his concerns regarding your presence here, so we might as well get that conversation out of the way before we proceed with the rest of the day's agenda. Dmitri proves Constantine right by launching into what sounds like a tirade in Russian, his voice rising with each sentence. And even though I can't understand the words, I can certainly grasp the tone. He thinks I'm a liability, a complication, possibly a plant sent by Julian to infiltrate their operation, and he's making his objections known with the kind of passion that suggests he's one of the few people who can speak to Constantine this way, without facing immediate consequences. Constantine listens patiently, occasionally interjecting with responses that sound calm and measured compared to Dmitri's increasingly agitated protests. And I'm watching this exchange like a tennis match, trying to read body language and vocal inflection for clues about what's being said. When suddenly both men go silent and turn to look at me with identical expressions of assessment that make me feel like a specimen under glass. "Dmitri believes you're going to get me killed," Constantine translates with what might be amusement if his expression wasn't so carefully neutral. "Or worse, that you're going to compromise our operations and lead Julian or the authorities directly to our doorstep. And he's not entirely wrong to be concerned, because keeping you here is a risk that I'm choosing to take despite his very valid objections." The honesty is almost refreshing, after years of Julian's carefully constructed lies and manipulations. And I appreciate that Constantine isn't trying to pretend that my presence here is anything other than a calculated gamble, a strategic decision that could pay off spectacularly, or blow up in all our faces depending on variables that none of us can fully control. "Then why take the risk?" I ask, directing the question at Constantine, but keeping Dmitri in my peripheral vision, because I've learned through painful experience that the greatest dangers often come from the people you're not watching closely enough. Because Julian Kress made the mistake of underestimating you, of treating you like a possession rather than a person. And in doing so, he's revealed exactly how weak his position really is. Constantine replies, pushing his empty plate aside and leaning forward with his elbows on the marble counter, his entire focus narrowing down to me in a way that makes the enormous penthouse feel suddenly intimate and claustrophobic. "And because I've spent the last 6 months watching you find small ways to resist him, tiny rebellions that he's too arrogant to notice, and I've realized that underneath all that polish and refinement he's forced onto you, there's someone who's capable of the kind of strategic thinking that could be very useful to me. The fact that he's been watching me for 6 months should horrify me, should send me running for the door despite the danger waiting outside. But instead, I find myself leaning in slightly, drawn by the promise implicit in his words, that he sees something in me beyond the decorative fiancé that Julian created, something valuable and powerful and worth cultivating. "I need to see what you do," I say suddenly, the words surprising me as much as they seem to surprise both men. But once I've started, I can't seem to stop. Because if I'm going to be part of whatever this is, if I'm going to help you destroy Julian, then I need to understand exactly who you are and what you're capable of, not just the version you show me over breakfast in your kitchen. Dmitri makes a sound that might be approval or might be disgust. I can't quite tell. But Constantine's expression shifts into something that looks almost like respect, and he stands with that predatory grace that I'm starting to recognize as his default mode of movement, already pulling out his phone and making arrangements in clipped Russian that suggests he's used to being obeyed immediately and without question. "Then you'll come with me today," he says, and there's a finality to the statement that makes it clear this isn't up for debate, that he's made a decision about how to handle me and my inconvenient demand for transparency. You'll see exactly what I am and what I do, and then you can decide whether you want to continue with this arrangement, or whether you'd prefer to take your chances back in Julian's world. 2 hours later, I find myself in the back of a Mercedes that probably has more security features than most military vehicles, sitting next to Constantine, while Dmitri drives us through Chicago's streets with the kind of aggressive efficiency that suggests he's done this route 1,000 times. And I'm wearing clothes that fit perfectly and make me look like I belong in this world of expensive cars and dangerous men, even though I feel like an imposter playing dress-up in someone else's life. The building we stop at looks legitimate enough from the outside, a luxury car dealership that caters to the kind of clientele who pay cash for Ferraris and don't ask too many questions about where the money comes from. But the moment we enter through a side door that requires a key code and a retinal scan, I understand that this is something else entirely. A front for whatever operations Constantine runs when he's not playing the civilized host in his penthouse. The office we enter is utilitarian in a way that his apartment isn't. All function and no form, with multiple monitors displaying what look like security feeds and financial data and information that I probably shouldn't be seeing. And there are men positioned throughout the space who all stop what they're doing the moment Constantine enters, their attention snapping to him with the kind of focused respect that fear and loyalty combined can create. "Gentlemen," Constantine says, his voice carrying easily across the room despite not being raised, commanding attention through sheer presence rather than volume. "This is Sarah, and she's going to be observing our operations today. So I expect you all to behave as professionally as you would if I were alone, which means no unnecessary brutality, and definitely no showing off." The last part is directed at a younger man who has the grace to look slightly embarrassed, and I'm trying to process the casual acknowledgement of necessary brutality versus the unnecessary kind when Constantine guides me to a chair positioned where I can see everything, but remain out of the way, his hand on the small of my back, a reminder that despite the illusion of choice he's given me, I'm still very much under his control. What follows is a masterclass in controlled violence and strategic intimidation, as Constantine handles what he calls business matters, with a combination of charm and menace that I'm beginning to understand is his signature approach. He offers people choices that aren't really choices, frames threats in the language of opportunity, and somehow makes his victims feel almost grateful for whatever mercy he's decided to show them. I watch him negotiate with a man who's apparently behind on payments for protection. Listen as he explains in that calm, reasonable voice exactly what will happen to the man's family if the debt isn't settled by end of business today. And I see the moment when the man's resistance crumbles, when he agrees to terms that are clearly extortionate, but still preferable to the alternative that Constantine has painted in such vivid detail. But it's the next meeting that really shows me who Konstantin Volkov is, beneath the expensive suits and cultured manners, when they bring in someone who Dmitri introduces as a traitor, a man who's been selling information to a rival organization, and I watch Konstantin's expression go from merely cold to something absolutely glacial as he listens to the evidence presented against this person who apparently once held a position of trust within the organization. The beating that follows is methodical and educational, with Constantine explaining to the assembled men exactly why this punishment is necessary, how betrayal cannot be tolerated because it threatens the entire structure they've built. And he does it all while sipping coffee from a paper cup and occasionally checking his phone, as if orchestrating someone's systematic destruction is just another item on his daily agenda that requires his attention, but not necessarily his emotional investment. And then, when the traitor is barely conscious and bleeding on the concrete floor, Constantine turns to me with those ice-blue eyes that have witnessed this scene countless times before, and he asks in that same conversational tone he used over breakfast whether I'd like more coffee, as if we're at a cafe discussing the weather, rather than standing in a room where a man is being beaten to within an inch of his life for the crime of disloyalty. "No, thank you," I manage to say, proud that my voice doesn't shake, that I'm able to meet his gaze without flinching even though everything inside me is screaming at the wrongness of this situation. at the casual brutality that he's showing me like it's a gift. A revelation of his true nature that I demanded to see. "Good," he says, and there's approval in his tone, as if I've passed some kind of test that I didn't know I was taking. Because we have one more stop to make, and I think you're going to find this one particularly interesting given your current circumstances. The drive to the next location takes us through parts of Chicago that I've never seen despite living here for 3 years. Neighborhoods where Julian would never venture because they don't fit his carefully curated image of urban sophistication. And when we finally stop, it's in front of a building that looks like it might have been a warehouse once, but has been converted into something else. Something that the security measures and armed guards suggest is very important to Constantine's operation. Inside, I find what appears to be a shelter of sorts, but not the kind that city officials would recognize or approve. This is a place for women and children who are running from the kind of danger that doesn't respond to restraining orders or police intervention. A safe house for people who need protection from threats that exist outside the normal legal framework. And I'm watching Constantine move through the space, greeting people by name, checking on children's progress in school, ensuring that everyone has what they need. And I'm trying to reconcile this version of him with the man who just supervised a brutal beating without blinking. This is what I do with the money that men like Julian would spend on art they don't appreciate and cars they don't need. Constantine explains, noticing my confusion, and apparently deciding that some context is necessary. Because I grew up in a place not so different from this, with a mother who had nowhere to run when my father's violence became too much. And I promised myself that if I ever had power, I would use some of it to make sure that other people didn't have to make the same impossible choices she did. The vulnerability in this admission, the glimpse of the person beneath the carefully constructed persona of the ruthless mob boss, does more to unsettle me than anything else I've witnessed today. Because it suggests that Konstantin Volkov is far more complex than I'd assumed, that his motivations are driven by something more than simple greed or power lust. And I'm not sure what to do with that information, or how it changes my understanding of the arrangement we've entered into. We're standing in what appears to be a common room where several women are watching their children play, and one of them approaches Constantine with the kind of careful respect that suggests she knows exactly who he is and what he's capable of, but also trusts him in a way that seems impossible given everything else I know about him. And she thanks him in accented English for giving her somewhere safe to stay, while she figures out her next steps. And I watch as his expression softens in a way I haven't seen before, becoming almost gentle despite the hard edges that never quite disappear. "This is Sarah." He introduces me to the woman, whose name I learn is Anya. "And she's going to be staying with me for a while, learning how things work, so if you see her around, you should know that she's under my protection, which means she's under yours as well." The way he phrases it, that I'm under their protection rather than they're under mine, suggests a different kind of power dynamic than I expected. And I'm shaking Anya's hand and accepting her welcome while trying to understand what Constantine is really telling these women about me, what role he's casting me in within his organization, and whether I'm ready to accept that identity. On the drive back to the penthouse, as the winter sun begins its early descent, and the city lights start to flicker on against the gathering darkness, I finally find the courage to ask the question that's been building since we left the car dealership and its room full of casual violence. "Why did you really bring me here today?" I ask, turning to face him in the back seat, while Dmitri drives with his attention seemingly focused on the road, but probably cataloging every word of our conversation. "Because I don't think it was just to show me what you're capable of, or to test whether I could handle seeing that side of your business." Constantine is quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the passing cityscape. And when he finally turns to look at me, there's something in his expression that I can't quite read, something that might be calculation or might be the closest thing to honesty that a man like him is capable of showing. "Because I needed you to understand that the world I operate in isn't black and white, that the violence you witnessed today funds the safety you saw afterward, and that if you're going to help me destroy Julian, you need to be comfortable with the fact that justice in my world doesn't come from courtrooms or legal proceedings, but from the kind of direct action that leaves permanent consequences," he says. And then his hand reaches out to cover mine, where it rests on the leather seat between us. His touch warm and surprisingly gentle despite the calluses that speak to violence I've now witnessed firsthand. And because I wanted you to see that I keep my promises about protection, that unlike Julian, who uses that word to justify control, when I say I'll keep you safe, I mean it in a way that extends beyond just you to everyone you might care about. The weight of his words settles over me like a physical thing, and I'm realizing that this day hasn't just been about showing me his world, but about giving me a choice. A real choice this time, informed by full knowledge of what saying yes actually means, about whether I want to stay in his protection and become part of whatever dark empire he's built, or whether I want to walk away and take my chances with Julian and the familiar hell I already know how to navigate. But before I can formulate a response, before I can begin to articulate the complex tangle of fear and fascination and desperate hope that's been building in my chest since the moment he pulled me into his penthouse last night, my phone buzzes with an incoming message, and when I look at the screen, I see Julian's name and a text that makes my blood run cold despite the heated car interior. "I know where you are, and I know what you're doing. And I promise you that whatever the Volkov Bratva is offering you isn't worth what I'm going to take from everyone you love if you don't come home within the next 24 hours. I show the message to Konstantin, watching as his expression shifts from the relative openness of our conversation into something harder and more dangerous. And when he looks up from the screen, his eyes have gone flat and cold in a way that reminds me exactly why people fear him, why his name is spoken in whispers by men who aren't afraid of much else. "Good," he says, handing my phone back with a smile that doesn't reach his eyes, a smile that promises violence and retribution, and the kind of calculated revenge that I've spent all day watching him plan and execute. Because I was beginning to think he didn't care enough to make this interesting. And there's nothing I enjoy more than teaching arrogant men what it feels like to lose everything they thought they owned. The safe house Konstantin has my family moved to within 6 hours of Julian's threat is nothing like I expected. Not some dingy apartment in a questionable neighborhood, but rather a comfortable suburban home in Evanston, with security measures so sophisticated that they're nearly invisible. And I'm standing in the kitchen watching my mother make tea with hands that won't stop shaking, while my younger sister Sophia asks questions that I can't answer about why we had to leave everything behind so suddenly. Why there are men with guns positioned at every entrance. Why our lives have been turned upside down because of choices I made without consulting anyone. "You should have told us," my mother says in the particular tone of voice that she reserves for moments when disappointment and fear are fighting for dominance in her heart. And I can see the accusations forming behind her eyes even though she's too kind to actually voice them all, too aware that I'm already drowning in guilt without her adding to the weight. "You should have told us that Julian was dangerous, that leaving him would put us all at risk, that you were involving yourself with people who operate outside the law and handle their problems with violence instead of lawyers." But the truth is that I didn't know, couldn't have predicted that my desperate flight from one monster would lead me directly into the arms of another, who somehow saw my arrival as an opportunity rather than an inconvenience, who had apparently been watching and waiting for exactly this kind of opening to present itself. And I'm trying to find the words to explain this to my mother, when Konstantin appears in the doorway, looking entirely too comfortable in this domestic setting, carrying grocery bags that he sets on the counter with the same casual efficiency he applies to everything else. "Mrs. Dmitriev?" he says with a respectful nod that somehow manages to be both genuine and carefully calculated to put her at ease. And I watch as my mother's expression shifts from maternal anger to the kind of cautious assessment that women develop when they've spent enough time navigating dangerous men to recognize one immediately. "I understand that this situation is far from ideal, but I want you to know that my protection extends to your entire family for as long as necessary. And unlike the man your daughter was engaged to, I don't make promises I don't intend to keep." The comparison to Julian is deliberate, a reminder that whatever else Konstantin might be, He's shown more genuine care for my family's safety in 6 hours than Julian did in 3 years of carefully orchestrated control, disguised as devotion. And I can see my mother processing this information, weighing the devil she knows against the one who's currently unpacking groceries in her temporary kitchen, like this is a perfectly normal evening activity. What follows over the next 2 weeks is a strange kind of double life, where I spend my days learning the intricacies of Constantine's empire, sitting in on meetings where business deals are negotiated with the kind of coded language that sounds legitimate, but carries implicit threats, watching him manage his various operations with a combination of strategic brilliance and ruthless efficiency that I'm beginning to understand is what's kept him alive and in power for so long, while my evenings are spent trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy with my family, pretending that the armed guards and security protocols are just temporary precautions rather than permanent fixtures of our new reality. But it's during the late nights, when my family is asleep, and I return to Constantine's penthouse that has somehow become a strange kind of home, despite its cold luxury, and the constant reminder of the violence that funds it, that I find myself drawn into conversations with him that feel dangerous in entirely different ways than the business dealings I've been observing. Moments where the carefully maintained distance between us dissolves into something more intimate and far more complicated than simple strategic alliance. Tell me about when you realized Julian wasn't who you thought he was, Constantine says one night as we sit in his study surrounded by books in multiple languages, and that chess set made of bullets that I've come to see as a perfect metaphor for how he views the world. And there's something in his voice that suggests he's not asking for tactical information, but rather seeking to understand the emotional landscape that brought me to his door. So I tell him about the first time Julian raised his voice at me for wearing the wrong dress to one of his events, how he apologized so profusely afterward that I convinced myself it was an aberration rather than a preview of what was to come. And then I tell him about the gradual escalation, the criticism disguised as concern, the isolation from friends and family presented as romantic exclusivity, the systematic dismantling of my confidence and autonomy that happened so slowly I didn't recognize it until I was already trapped. And I watch as Constantine's expression grows darker with each revelation, his hands clenching into fists that make me think of that first night when his knuckles were bloody. He made you believe you were the problem, Constantine observes, with the kind of insight that suggests he's seen this pattern before. Perhaps in his own childhood with the father he briefly mentioned, perhaps in the countless women who've passed through his shelter, seeking escape from men who wielded control like a weapon. And the brilliance of that particular form of torture is that by the time you realize what's happening, you've already internalized so much of the blame that leaving feels like admitting defeat rather than claiming victory. The understanding in his words does something to the careful walls I've built around the most painful parts of my experience with Julian, and I find myself sharing things I've never told anyone. The nights I spent questioning my own sanity, because Julian's version of events was so different from my memories, the way he used my love for my family as leverage to ensure my compliance. The particular kind of terror that comes from knowing that the person who's supposed to protect you is actually the greatest threat to your safety. And through it all, Constantine listens with an intensity that feels like being truly seen for the first time in years. "I'm going to destroy him," Constantine says when I finally fall silent. And there's no bravado in the statement, no theatrical pronouncement of revenge, just a simple declaration of fact delivered in the same tone he might use to discuss tomorrow's weather. Not just his business empire or his reputation, but the fundamental belief he has that he's untouchable, that he can take what he wants and discard it when it no longer serves his purposes, and you're going to help me do it. Because you know exactly where he's vulnerable in ways that no amount of surveillance or intelligence gathering could reveal. And so begins my education in strategic destruction, as Constantine teaches me to see Julian's empire not as the invincible fortress he's convinced everyone it is, but rather as a house of cards, built on leveraged debt and illegal arrangements and relationships that only exist because people are more afraid of him than they are loyal to him. And I discover that I have a talent for this kind of analytical thinking, for identifying the weak points in systems that appear solid. for understanding how to apply pressure in exactly the right places to cause maximum damage. But the lessons aren't just intellectual. Constantine also insists that I learn practical skills: how to handle a weapon with confidence even though I pray I'll never need to use one, how to recognize when someone is lying or trying to manipulate me, how to move through dangerous spaces with the kind of awareness that might save my life if everything goes wrong. And during these training sessions, I become acutely conscious of his proximity, of the way his hands guide mine into proper position, of the heat that builds between us despite all the very good reasons why acting on it would be catastrophic. The tension finally breaks one night after a particularly frustrating session where I couldn't seem to master the disarming technique he was trying to teach me. When I throw the practice weapon down in disgust and he catches my wrist in that same firm grip from the first night, spinning me around to face him with a force that's just shy of rough. And suddenly we're standing so close that I can feel his breath on my face, can see the flecks of darker blue in his ice-colored eyes, can sense the same attraction I've been fighting reflected in his expression. "You're not broken, Petichka," he says, using a new endearment that I later learn means little bird, and there's something almost fierce in his voice, in the way he's looking at me like he's trying to will me to believe him through sheer force of conviction. "You're not damaged or weak or any of the things that Julian convinced you were true, and I need you to understand that before we go any further with this, because when I take you, and make no mistake, I will take you if you give me even the slightest indication that it's what you want. It won't be like it was with him, won't be about control or possession, but about choosing to give yourself to someone who actually sees your strength instead of trying to diminish it." The promise implicit in his words ignites something in me that I thought Julian had extinguished completely, and I'm reaching for Constantine before I can second-guess the decision, pulling him down into a kiss that tastes like whiskey and danger and the particular kind of recklessness that comes from knowing you're making a terrible choice but being unable to stop yourself, and his response is immediate and overwhelming, hands tangling in my hair as he backs me against his desk in a recreation of that moment weeks ago when I agreed to stay. Except this time, there's no hesitation, no strategic pause to consider implications. What follows is a collision of desperation and dark desire that erases whatever distance we'd been maintaining, his mouth trailing fire down my throat while my hands explore the muscled planes of his back. And I'm lost in sensation until my phone, which I'd left on his desk, buzzes with an incoming call that we both ignore until it stops and immediately starts again, the insistent ringtone cutting through the haze of want and reminding us both that we exist in a world where timing and strategy matter more than desire. Constantine pulls back with visible effort, his breathing as ragged as mine, and reaches for the phone with a curse in Russian that I'm beginning to understand means something has gone very wrong. And when he answers, I can hear Dmitri's voice, on the other end, urgent and sharp with warning, speaking too quickly for me to follow but clearly delivering news that changes everything. "Julian knows about the safe house," Constantine says after ending the call. His expression shifting back into that cold calculation that I've learned means he's already 3 moves ahead in whatever chess game is being played. And he's threatening to go public with information about my operations unless you're returned to him within the hour, which means he's finally made the mistake I've been waiting for. He's shown exactly how desperate he is, how much power you actually have over him, and now we can use that against him in ways he won't see coming until it's far too late. The attack on Constantine's penthouse comes exactly when he predicted it would, with Julian's private security team breaching the lobby with the kind of aggressive confidence that suggests they've been assured this will be easy, that retrieving one wayward fiancé from a criminal organization is simply a matter of overwhelming force and expensive lawyers on standby. But what they don't know, what Julian in his arrogance couldn't possibly have anticipated, is that Constantine has spent the last 3 hours turning his building into a fortress specifically designed to capture rather than repel intruders. Because the goal tonight isn't just to protect me, but to gather evidence and witnesses that will destroy Julian in ways that bullets and threats never could. I'm positioned exactly where Constantine insisted I should be, in his study with Dmitri standing guard and a laptop open in front of me, showing security feeds from every angle of the building. watching as Julian's men move through corridors that Constantine's people have deliberately left unguarded, funneling the intruders toward the penthouse level where the real confrontation will happen. And I should be terrified, but instead I feel a strange kind of calm that comes from finally understanding that I'm not a victim waiting to be rescued, but rather an active participant in my own liberation. A weapon that Constantine has helped me sharpen, but that I'm choosing to wield. The sound of gunfire erupts from somewhere below us. Sharp cracks that make my heart race despite Constantine's assurance that his men are using non-lethal rounds designed to incapacitate rather than kill. Because even in the midst of orchestrating Julian's downfall, he's thinking about the legal implications, about maintaining plausible deniability, and ensuring that when authorities arrive, they'll find a clear case of home invasion, rather than the kind of mutual combat that might complicate the narrative we're constructing. Constantine appears in the doorway of the study, moving with that predatory grace even though I can see blood seeping through his shirt from a wound on his shoulder that he's completely ignoring, and the sight of him injured because of me, because he chose to protect me instead of simply handing me back to Julian and avoiding this entire confrontation, does something to the carefully maintained emotional distance I've been trying to preserve, shattering it completely as I realize that this man who kills without hesitation and rules through fear has somehow become someone I trust more than anyone else in my life. He's here, Constantine says, his voice carrying that particular edge that means violence is imminent. And he's reaching for me, pulling me up from the desk and guiding me toward the bedroom with instructions delivered in rapid Russian to Dmitri, who nods and disappears into the chaos of the penthouse, where I can hear shouting and the sounds of physical confrontation. And I need you to do exactly what we discussed. Need you to be strong for just a little bit longer, because everything we've planned depends on you being able to face him without breaking, without giving him the satisfaction of seeing that he still has any power over you whatsoever. The bedroom door opens, and Julian is there, flanked by two of his security team, who look significantly worse for wear after fighting their way through Constantine's defenses. And seeing him again after weeks of absence is like looking at a stranger wearing a familiar face, because I can see now what I couldn't see before: the narcissism behind his charm, the cruelty beneath his cultured exterior, the absolute conviction that he owns me in ways that transcend any legal or moral boundaries. "Sarah," he says, and his voice carries that particular tone of disappointed patience that he used to use before the psychological torture would begin, before he would spend hours explaining all the ways I'd failed to meet his expectations. "You've caused quite a bit of trouble, and I think it's time we discuss your return home and the consequences of this little rebellion you've staged with the help of criminals who are simply using you to get leverage over my business interests." But before I can respond, before I can deliver the speech that Constantine and I rehearsed about my refusal to return and my intention to testify about Julian's abuse, Constantine himself steps into the room with a gun in one hand and my phone in the other. And on the screen I can see that we're recording, that every word Julian speaks is being captured and transmitted to multiple secure locations, where it will serve as evidence of his attempt to kidnap me from protective custody. "Julian Kress," Constantine says with the kind of formal politeness that somehow makes the situation even more menacing. And I watch as Julian's expression shifts from confident control to dawning realization that he's walked directly into a trap that was set specifically for him. "I believe you're trespassing in my home, threatening a woman who's under my protection, and about to make several statements about your business practices that I'm sure federal investigators will find absolutely fascinating. So please continue explaining to Sarah why she belongs to you and what consequences you plan to impose for her daring to exercise basic human autonomy." What follows is a confrontation that I'll remember for the rest of my life, as Julian's carefully constructed facade crumbles under the combined pressure of being caught on camera and facing someone who isn't intimidated by his wealth or connections. And I watch him cycle through rage and bargaining and threats with increasing desperation, while Constantine simply stands there with that gun pointed at Julian's chest and an expression of mild interest, as if he's observing a particularly fascinating psychological experiment rather than the destruction of a man's entire empire. The federal agents arrive precisely on schedule, because of course Constantine has people on his payroll who are more loyal to him than to their badges, and they find Julian in the middle of a tirade about his rights and his lawyers, and how none of this will stand up in court, completely unaware that the evidence against him goes far beyond tonight's home invasion to include financial crimes and illegal surveillance and a pattern of abuse documented by the victims from his past that Constantine's people have spent weeks tracking down and convincing to come forward. I watch as they take Julian away in handcuffs, his eyes finding mine one last time with an expression that promises this isn't over even though we both know it is, that his empire is crumbling and his reputation is destroyed, and the carefully curated image of the brilliant entrepreneur who could do no wrong has been replaced by the reality of a predator who finally met someone willing to fight back with equal ruthlessness. The penthouse falls silent after the authorities leave with their prisoner and their evidence, and I find Constantine sitting in his study with that shoulder wound finally being attended to by someone who's clearly done this many times before. And when he sees me standing in the doorway, he dismisses the medic with a gesture and holds out his hand in invitation, drawing me close when I cross the room to stand between his legs, his hands settling on my hips with a possessiveness that I'm choosing to accept, rather than resist. "You have a choice now, Solnishko," he says, looking up at me with those ice-blue eyes that have witnessed so much violence and somehow still manage to hold gentleness when they focus on me. "You can walk away from all of this, start over somewhere new with your family, and the resources I'll provide to ensure you never have to depend on anyone's protection again. Or you can stay here and learn to navigate this world not as my possession, but as my equal, as someone who understands the darkness I live in and chooses it anyway." The choice should be obvious. I should take the escape he's offering and build a normal life far away from the violence and moral ambiguity that defines Constantine's existence. But as I look around his study with its books and bullet chess set and the view of Chicago spread out below us like a kingdom built on blood and strategy, I realize that normal isn't what I want anymore. That 3 years of living in Julian's gilded cage has taught me that safety and comfort mean nothing if they come at the cost of my autonomy. And that Constantine, for all his darkness and danger, has given me something Julian never could: the freedom to choose my own path, even if that path leads straight into the heart of his empire. "I stay," I whisper, watching as satisfaction and something that might be relief crosses his face. "But not as your queen in the traditional sense, not as someone who exists in your shadow or plays the role of decorative partner to legitimize your operations, but as someone who builds her own power within your world, who transforms your legitimate businesses into something that can stand scrutiny while your darker operations continue beneath the surface, who becomes indispensable not because of what I mean to you personally, but because of what I can accomplish professionally." 6 months later, I'm standing in Constantine's penthouse, our penthouse now, though we maintain separate spaces within it as a reminder that proximity isn't ownership, reviewing financial statements for the network of legitimate businesses I've built using his resources and my understanding of how to navigate systems that Julian thought he controlled. And there's a knock at the door at midnight that echoes the night that changed everything. And this time, when I answer, I'm wearing Constantine's ring on my finger and carrying a gun in a holster beneath my tailored jacket, and the person on the other side isn't running from danger, but rather seeking the kind of protection that only we can provide. And I realize with crystalline clarity that I've become exactly what Constantine promised I could be. Not the girl who knocked on the wrong door in desperate flight, but a woman who's transformed that moment of chaos into deliberate power, who's learned that sometimes salvation comes from embracing darkness rather than fleeing it, and who's discovered that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't the monster you're running from, but the monster you choose to become when you finally stop running and decide to fight back with everything you have.